So I'm going to be talking about designing for innovation for your first VR game. I don't usually do bios because I have so much content, so that's true here as well. And also apologies in advance if I'm a little breathless. It's my first time speaking after some lung issues. So I'm going to try to maintain my breath. So at Skydance Interactive, we just shipped our first VR title, Archangel. So Skydance Interactive was originally called The Workshop, and it's founded by the founders of Treyarch. So I wasn't at Treyarch, but the leadership as a whole have been making games since the mid-90s. So we've got quite a lot of experience. But we learned a lot making Archangel, and that's what I'm going to cover in this presentation. So a little bit about the game.
Rip them out of the sky.
So it is a dual hand motion-controlled shooter. You're piloting a 6-story mech and taking on a variety of enemies. You are on rails, which I'll talk about a little bit in my presentation. As a part of that, you can change weapons on individual hands. You can shield. You can punch things in the environment. It's very physical feeling. We worked really hard to get a not quite one-to-one with the mech hands. It turns out if we made the mech hands one-to-one, you felt like you were a robot and not like you were piloting a mech. It includes upgrading your mech in between missions, and it also includes a pretty strong narrative for an action game in VR, where your squad mates will be talking to you in the field. You can talk to them between missions, and it also has a pretty extensive intro scene as well. So as designers, we're used to being both the first and the last car on the train, and by that I mean we set the tone for the game as a whole in our designs, and then we get the assets and systems back from the team and implement the game content. But a lot of this that I go over in the talk may seem to verge a little bit to be more production than design, but that's because as designers, we're the primary architects as well. So we absolutely need to understand how long it takes roughly to build things and how some of the challenges work in VR so we can help set our teams up for success. So that's why there's a little bit of production-y talk in this. So one of the things we learned, though, working in VR is that the things that you know about creating traditional games, you can throw a lot of that in the trash. And sometimes it's so far from what you know that it's even hard to hit the trash can with the things that you're throwing away. So what I'm going to talk about is a few of the what I would call best practices that we learned. And I'm going to start with not making any assumptions. So working in VR. So it changes a lot of the paradigms. And what that means is you can't anticipate what's going to be different in VR from the traditional space. And we tried to anticipate and were wrong about a lot of it. So for example, there's the obvious. It's hard to anticipate what's going to make players nauseous or disoriented. It's hard to anticipate what's going to be too intense for players. And by too intense, I mean too many effects going on in their face, too much audio, too many busy things going on the screen, too much gore, too much action. It's hard to anticipate that. It's hard to anticipate what players actually won't notice. I'm going to talk about that a little bit with environments. But when you give players a more even 180 environment, even if you're not full 360, understanding what they're going to be looking at and trying to funnel them toward what you want them to look at is challenging. And also, I'll talk about performance a tiny bit several times. So it's also hard to understand what's going to limit your performance, even if you're old school console developers like we are. So one of the things that is important is to walk in the footprints of games that have gone before you. So what that means for us was you look at comp titles, and in this case, comp titles aren't just titles that are competitive with yours. They're titles that have examples similar to your game. So what I mean by that is you may find, if you're making, for example, a slow-paced narrative game, you may find the best example of locomotion that would work in your game is in an action game. So you need to look beyond your genre for the best examples of what people are doing. The whole team needs to play those games, and the whole team needs to talk about what works and doesn't work in them, because you don't want to end up in a situation where only part of the team understands what functions and what doesn't. And then you need to be willing to use those as a starting point or even as your end point. You may decide that the way they implemented something is perfect for your game and you don't need to work on it anymore yourself. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute as well. So the next thing we learned is that you have to prototype everything. You'll do way more prototyping in VR than you will in a traditional game. So you want to use those comp games as your shortcuts. You want to start with where they started, And then your prototype will be what they did. And you will move on from there. You don't want to start trying to reinvent the wheel. As with always with prototyping, you want to start with the highest risks and the biggest unknowns that you have, because you want to take on those as early as possible. As always with prototypes, you want to work in quick, rough iterations. But what's most important is don't worry about your production pipeline, because you may discover what you want to do does not work at all in VR, and if you've tried to do it the right way and develop a pipeline, you will have wasted that time. And the most important point I can make that was one of the biggest lessons for me was understand what you need context for in order to know if it works. So what works in gray box may not work with effects, it may not work with audio, it may not work in the final level, and the reverse is true. So we had instances where something made people nauseous in gray box and was fine in the final game. So as much as possible, you need to try to contextualize all of your prototypes. Get things textured, get audio, get effects, try to get as close as you can to simulating a real environment. I would advise everybody to focus on one innovation. Look for one thing that you're going to do that makes your game different. When you figure out what that innovation is, assess the difficulty, look at comp games again. You can kind of figure out what some of the biggest challenges in VR are by looking at what other people don't do well. So one of the things to avoid is what I call smart guy syndrome, which is where you see a bunch of people failing trying to do something, and you're like, we're smart guys, we can do it. So similarly, consider your team's experience and strengths. If you've never made a fighting game, doing your first fighting game in VR is probably not a great idea. Pick something you feel like you're already good at. Then take that single new element as your innovation focus and work on it until you get it right. And don't start on another area of innovation until you've nailed the first one, because you may only have time for one. Expect everything to be delayed. So everything takes longer to develop in VR. And by that, I actually really mean everything. And so some of the things that'll cause delays, like one of the strangest but largest ones, is iteration. It takes longer in VR. So you're either going to pay the price when you prototype up front, or you're going to pay the price with having to iterate more once you get the feature there. On top of that, actually iterating itself takes longer, because you have to push the build, put on the headset, grab the controllers, play the thing, take off the headset, make the change. I would estimate teams can lose, each person, up to an hour a day to that cycle. And if you go into it thinking you can share hardware, like 2 or 3 artists share the same headset, you can multiply that by 2 or 3 times. There's a lot more iteration required for VR, and it always takes longer. So you can expect tech challenges as well. So some of the tech challenges that we end up, do we have a plug for this? It just popped up a power warning.
Oh.
So I'll keep speaking while you sort that out. So you can expect a lot of tech challenges. Some of them that you'll expect are things like needing your performance indicators and your iteration tools in headset, because you need to be looking around in the headset and watch for your frame rate to drop, for example. You can't rely on traditional performance tools that are either out of engine or can't run in headset. Some other technical challenges are things like managing multiple platforms, which can be very different. We have a long history at the workshop / Skydance Interactive of working on multiple new consoles before they are on the market. And it still, for us, was a tremendous amount of work trying to manage multiple platforms. So you have to assume that everything you're doing technically is going to be a little harder than you actually expect it's going to be. And you can expect process challenges too. So that goes back to things like everybody on the team needs a headset. Everything's going to take longer to do. Having people who are working remotely makes everything more difficult. If you think about it, if you're using motion controllers, you can end up in a situation where you're trying to describe what's happening in the game, and the person who's working remotely has no idea what your hands are doing. So little things like that make it a little more challenging. I might actually be a little late since we started. So some specific design tips. So designing interactions. Your interactions will work differently, and the thing that you need to keep in mind is that you have different skill levels and different patience levels. So, for example, in Archangel, it's two-handed motion-controlled shooting. We discovered that some people are just inherently not good at that. And I'm one of them. I'm great with a controller, but when I have to do something different with each hand, it kind of breaks for some people. The other thing is, if you think about, we've all got experience with agile development. There's a reason meetings are called stand-ups. It's because when you're standing up, you don't want to do something very long, right? It keeps the meeting short. So if you think about it, if you're making a thoughtful VR game and you require players to stand, you're shortening their play session. It's hard to be really thoughtful in a longer game when somebody's making you stand. People have different limits for how much they're willing to play a game that involves a lot of arm waving, right? Not everybody works at desk jobs. So somebody who comes home from a long day working retail doesn't want to stand and wave his hands around for 2 hours in your game. So you have to think about things like that when you're designing your interactions. With UI, some of the challenges are text is extremely difficult to read. You have to think about it in non-traditional terms. I still found myself saying things like, at the side of the screen. Well, there kind of is no side of the screen in VR. You need to be aware of the fact that UI can help and hinder nausea. And you kind of don't know which one it's going to do until you try it, but it can work both ways. It's one of the few environments where people can actually get disoriented and nauseous from you moving your UI elements around. So you need to actually prototype that in context as well, because UI that works in a gray box won't work when the screen gets busier. And then locomotion. I think I just lost power.
Just lost power?
Yep. So I'll just talk about locomotion. You'll miss the fact that the bullet point said good luck with that, because good luck with that. We have been doing motion controls for years and hardware-oriented games for years, and we didn't take on motion control. That was intentional, because it is one of the, or we didn't take on locomotion, because it's one of the hardest problems to solve in VR. I don't think anybody has really solved it well. If you're going to take it on with great caution. Look at what other games have done. Start with what they did. It's not the place for you to try your first big experiments in VR, is by thinking you're going to invent some new locomotion solution that's magically going to be better than what everybody else has done. The odds are you're not going to, and it can be a huge, huge rabbit hole that you and your team go down that ends up spending so much of your time trying to figure out how to move players through the world without making them sick, that you end up skipping other things that make the game fun. So figure out your locomotion early, but don't let it drive everything that you do. And then a quick word about designing environments. So designing environments in VR is really challenging because you can't funnel the player's focus the way that you normally would in a game. So when you're designing environments in VR, you need to try to steer the player toward what you want him to look at. You need to understand that your environments are going to play differently once you have a headset on, and that you honestly can't control what players are looking at, what they see, what they don't see. If they can miss whole scenes that you think are really important just because they happen to not look that direction. So focus testing, getting real players in your environments as quickly as possible, asking them what they saw and what they didn't. Even running tests where you'll put in a fake object just to say, did you see the clown over at the side of the screen? Or at the side of the level, just to see if people are looking. You need to do things like that in VR, because the things you take for granted about traditional games doesn't always work that way. So the end result was we're super proud of Archangel and are definitely carrying that forward. We're making a Walking Dead VR game. And a lot of what we learned in Archangel is rolling over into that game. But the biggest takeaway that I would give everybody is to make no assumptions. Go into it knowing you're going to have to prototype. You're going to have to figure things out. You're going to get things wrong. You're going to have to test. And go into it with an open mind, so that when you discover things, some of which will be things you didn't anticipate that are great, you have a schedule that's open enough and a team that's open-minded enough to be able to really take that and run with it. So thank you.
I suppose one question I would ask is, you spoke a lot about how the difference between, say, full production value and grey box versions of environments, for example, and of UI produce very different reactions from players. So have you figured out a good method to try and, other than like literally building everything out to production quality to figure it out, have you figured out a method to try and sort of shortcut that?
Well, you need to definitely take one environment through to full vertical slice, right? That will help you identify some of your broader rules. Like for us, it helped us identify how to make motion that feels natural, because while you're on rails, our first implementations of it were very mechanical feeling. They weren't pausing where people would pause. You weren't pausing when there were things to look at. We learned about hills. We learned about, for example, when you're on rails in VR, taking a player around a curve, you want to go ahead and put things over there that are interesting to look at so the player's looking that way. and kind of looking into the turn. So you can learn broad rules like that in your first vertical slice.
So you're like pulling their attention around, basically.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then after that, you just have to make sure you bake in plenty of time at the end to revisit your levels and make pretty broad changes to them sometimes. So it's more about learning what you can up front and then making sure you have the time at the end to adjust.
Right. That's amazing. Here we go.
Okay. If you're budgeting for your first VR title, do you add 50%, 100%, 203% to your traditional title?
I would say at least 100%. And that's not considering the cost of hardware for the whole team, right? So that's on top of hardware, because they have to have good PCs and, right, there's a long list of what people need. So I'd say at least 100%. Now you can do that with, and what I would recommend is adding time. VR is a harder problem to solve by throwing people at it because of the amount of invention involved. If you do try to solve it by throwing people at it rather than giving more time, then you want multiple prototype teams working at the same time.
Second
right?
part of the question is, how much do you have to dummy down your assets from a traditional game to handle VR?
Yeah, so part of me not being able to show my presentation is how much performance came up. Performance comes up a lot. And yeah, you do have to compromise. And it's a difficult compromise in VR, partly because you have to maintain frame rate, consistent frame rate, right? So most of us, even those of us who work on console shooters, are accustomed to the environment where once you go into cutscene or anything like that, you can let the frame rate dip, right? It's only during the action sequences, but in VR, you can't let the frame rate dip ever, right? It also, though, comes with a certain expectation of immersiveness, and that expectation of immersiveness can be hard to achieve with really, really stylized graphics. So that's the other thing that made it more challenging. So Archangel isn't photoreal by any means, but we realized we had to start to get somewhat close to that, at least in terms of lighting and effects, for people to really feel immersed in a world and feel like they're a part of a world. So I think that's the other challenge with performance is you can't rely on some of the stylized looks that you would rely on normally if you were doing like a Nintendo like Switch game or something, right? And you had to reduce your assets, you can't rely on stylization quite as much, I don't think, in VR as you can in traditional games.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Laralyn.
Thanks.